Ludmilla went from village to village, tying up loose ends with each while presenting a similar series of questions to the Xenon members in their respective ateliers. They all presented more or less the same answers, reinforcing Moranbor's initial notion that those who had come to Warden's Vale were members of low-ranking groups, expendable individuals allowed to investigate the Sorceress Kingdom. Isabella's description of how the organization operated also brought several concerns to Ludmilla's attention. The foreign policy of the Sorceress Kingdom was open-armed. His Majesty's administration worked to prove to the world that they sought to engage with the region as a benign, or at least non-aggressive, actor. To that end, borders were open to all as long as they obeyed the law, and visitors were encouraged to spread the word of the peaceful nature of the Sorceress Kingdom. Even spies were allowed to spy to their heart's content as long as they didn't go where they weren't supposed to. Warden's Vale had become a place with various facilities where unauthorized individuals weren't supposed to go. The way that the harbor and the farming villages were planned separated those industries considered sensitive and confidential by recent legislation. Light towers housed them in the villages, while the harbor contained them inside its main citadel. This provided physical distance and defense against mundane intrusion. It did not, however, stop those within from disclosing information through magical means like message spells. It was good that magic casters were able to quickly spread word and attract more magic casters, but Ludmilla had no way to know what they told others, or if they were reporting to a patron or superior that had sent them there. For the time being, she could only set them to productive tasks that didn't involve anything confidential and pray that their time and experience in Warden's Vale would convince them that genuine allegiance to the Sorceress Kingdom was in their best interests. If I disclose the fact that I am undead to the Xenon migrants, will that help matters? Probably not. They all sought Leichdom, but it was to achieve their personal ends. It was more likely that she became a research subject, in which case she had no answers to satisfy them. She didn't even know why she was undead in the first place, so judging the Xenon migrants for their motives would be hypocritical should she discover that her own reason for existence was similarly self-serving. Leluvian had already taken over for her sister by the time Ludmilla returned to the harbor. Her maid was resting on the second floor, watching her skeleton helpers clean up one of the rooms. The place was only a few weeks old, but her household was relentless when it came to keeping it tidy. Leluvian. The chambermaid stirred in her seat. My lady. I have something for you to do. Ah, really? Leluvian carefully rose from her seat, and Ludmilla winced internally at her eager response. She kept her interactions with everyone, including her own household, to a minimum. Her staff in the city had work enough to keep them somewhat busy, but things were relatively quiet in Warden's Vale despite the changes going on all around them. With everything as it was, Ludmilla felt like she was snubbing the Lynham sisters. Bring out the maps for the upper reaches from last month, Ludmilla told Leluvian. The reports for all of the enemy positions and movements should be in the archive with them. Yes, my lady, Leluvian nodded. What shall I do with them? Organize some undead patrols to check on each battle site, the Central Valley, the camps, interdiction points, everything where any violence was committed by our forces. Try and find out where the local demi-human tribes are located now, as well. Is there anything in particular I should be looking out for? The undead. Ludmilla's lips drew into a thin line. A great deal of death happened out there recently, so we need to clean up after ourselves. Destroy any minor undead that you find. Attempt to detain anything significant. Hand off your duties to Leluvian when she takes over for the day. It should take at least a week to conduct a satisfactory initial investigation, and we will be keeping an eye on things for the indeterminate future, so please don't strain yourselves. Yes, my lady, Leluvian lowered her head. May we occupy one of the rooms on the second floor for this? Order any furnishings that you require. Make sure you rotate the patrols so they all gain some familiarity with the environment here. I'm to use the servitors from the army? That is correct, Ludmilla told her. Patrols of 2 contingents each. One of the officers from each patrol will direct things on the field, the other will work with you here and communicate with their counterpart. What about the local tribes? If they hit you, Ludmilla said, hit them back. Do not chase them outside of the patrol areas, however. They are free to watch all they want as long as they do not attack us. Do you think the theocracy will be working out there as well, my lady? It is our mess. They will not move unless the situation escalates into something that threatens human lands. Leluvian went off to prepare, and Ludmilla went up to her bedroom on the third floor. After pulling the shawl off of her head and casting aside her mantle, she flopped down onto her bed. She inhaled deeply as she tightly hugged one of her pillows, kicking her boots off and feeling the cool sheets rub against her feet as she curled up on the mattress. The undead had a reputation as unfeeling, dispassionate monsters, yet Ludmilla felt that she was more emotional than ever before. Emotional and stressed. She wanted to blame some unknown quality of her new undead state, but, in her heart, she knew that her suffering was self-inflicted. She worried constantly. Things that she would note at a glance and seamlessly incorporate into her thoughts and decisions were now details that she examined and re-examined. All of it was because of Ludmilla's new undead existence and the fears that she harbored about herself. Even casual conversation could turn sour in her ears. Was there a hidden meaning behind an innocent remark? Did someone just hint to her that they knew what she had become? The things that her former self would take in good humor, be they jokes, offhand remarks or light-hearted banter, could inflict cruel emotional injuries and disturb her mental balance. It was not that anyone had changed in the way they interacted with her. If anything, they were more open and friendly with her than ever before. She just couldn't help but overthink everything. A word here, a gesture there, it all slowly piled up around her until she felt like she was wading through a mire of loneliness and guilt over her own existence. She trudged forward until exhaustion overcame her, and curled up in an effort to relax and hope that some of it would dissipate. An untiring, unfailing body. Yet her mind felt so fragile. As a human, her mental endurance was seemingly endless. She had to force herself to rest so her body could keep up. As undead, it was the other way around. The murmur of distant conversation drifted in through her open window. Ludmilla set the pillow aside and stood to look out from the shadows of her bedroom. The plaza below was occupied by dozens of villagers, a sight unheard of in rural regions before recent months. A steady trickle of magical conveniences meant that all of her population centers were now well lit, freeing the people from their dependency on daylight. Artisans worked well into the evening. People socialized at night. The abundance and wealth provided by the harvest spread from the farming village to the harbor, slowly nudging the sleepy economy of Warden's Vale into wakefulness. The long months of planning and uncertainty over the territory's future were giving way to slow, yet inevitable, progress. Watching those under her charge enjoy the fruit of those efforts was one of the few things that took Ludmilla's mind off of her personal worries for a time. Of the 5 farming villages planned, 3 were fully constructed and mostly populated. The 4th village was halfway done, and the number of laborers she now had available made progress swift. The 5th village had its foundations raised and materials were being collected to be used once the 4th village was completed. After the villages were finished, the focus of development would switch to the harbor. With everything carefully sorted out in advance and contingent on migration and domestic growth, she found herself doing far less work now than in the early months of her administration. Clara had a maxim, one passed down to her from her father: hurry up and wait, opportunity is seized by the prepared. To house Corlin, it meant that one should be prepared for opportunities before they presented themselves. Those who chased opportunities were bound to have them snatched away by those who were already ready for them. Frantically reacting to events as they happened was both time-consuming and wasteful. One could, of course, not be prepared for everything. Foresight, knowledge and experience were required to navigate the way to the most promising prospects. Clara was a master of this maxim, and her superlative intellect allowed her to guide Corlin County to unprecedented prosperity with incomprehensible grace. Ludmilla thought it a sensible way of approaching things, but she never had the opportunity to employ it in her domain before. Now, it felt like she had reached that state of waiting, though admittedly she had little to prepare relative to the other nobles of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. A knock at the door turned her attention away from the window. "Yes? My lady," Leluvian's voice sounded from the other side, "a guest has arrived to see you." That was strange. There were no audiences scheduled for the evening, nor did she see anyone approach the entrance. Those who could get past her notice in the harbor village were few. It was probably one of the vampire brides returning from their work around the domain with something to report. There was also the possibility that it was one of the servants of the Sorcerer King. "Who is it?" "It's Nobby, from Darkness." "Or an adamantide adventurer?" "I will be right down," she replied. "Do you require any assistance, my lady?" "No, I am still dressed." Ludmilla stepped lightly down the stairs, finding Nobbe awaiting her at a table before her makeshift audience hall. "Good evening, Miss Nobbe," she said. "To what do I owe the pleasure of your visit?" In response, Nobbe placed her fingers on an envelope resting on the table, sliding it forward. Ludmilla retrieved the letter and examined the seal. It was from the Department of Justice. A noble interacted with all of the branches of the government, but having something like this hand-delivered by an adamantite adventurer was unheard of. She broke open the seal, opening the letter and unfolding the document within. A furrow formed on her brow as she scanned through the content. An appointment as an investigator for incidents in Valkyrie County. With Nobbe as an aide, she assumed that it meant as an escort or in the event that force was required during the investigation. Aside from not being aware of anything of the sort, the wording on the order was very broad. It could technically dispatch her to investigate any incident at any time, as long as it occurred in Valkyrie County. Ludmilla's breath stilled when she reached the bottom of the missive. She knelt before Nobbe, lowering her head. The document was not signed by the Prime Minister or any official from the judiciary, but by the Sorcerer King himself. "I am at His Majesty's service." "Good. We're leaving, Woodlouse." That Nobbe addressed her in such a fashion had completely slipped Ludmilla's mind. She wondered why more people were calling her that in recent times. Maybe there was some story about her that was being passed around. Ludmilla brushed off her knees as she rose to her feet again. "Have you any idea what this is about, Miss Nobbe?" "You will find out when we arrive," the adventurer answered. "How will we be traveling?" "There is a designated teleportation zone inside Croston." Ludmilla quickly went through a mental inventory. Her infinite haversacks contained everything she would need for a long patrol, so what she had on her person was more than enough to wander around Valkyrie County should she be required to. She went upstairs to pick up her shawl and mantle before returning to Nobbe and giving her a nod. Nobbe placed a hand on her shoulder. Greater teleportation. Her vision shifted, and the polished stone floor of the repurposed shophouse was replaced by a raised wooden platform facing a somewhat familiar town square. Croston's appearance had changed much since the time she had passed through on the way to Facet County. The festive decorations in her memory had been replaced with even more festive decorations, and the square was brightly lit. An air of celebration hung over the evening and on the expressions of the townspeople. Nobbe stepped off of the platform and was immediately swarmed by admirers. Ludmilla idly wondered how Nobbe would be able to do her job as an escort if she was constantly accosted by the citizens. Ludmilla spoke to one of the men who was trying to push his way through from the side. "It looks like there's some sort of celebration here today," Ludmilla said. "Count's got hisself married," the man slurred. "Hey, you're not too bad, how about we GLRPH?" A gloved hand appeared from the throng of people to push the man away. Nobbe appeared right behind it. "Move," she told her. "Move where?" Ludmilla scanned their surroundings, then realized they were standing in front of what looked to be a town hall. Accustomed to seeing manors used as administrative centers in rural areas, she wasn't sure what the proper protocols were for such a building. The space indoors, however, resembled the administrative office in Nerantal. Two elder liches stood silently behind a long desk at the end of a long carpet laid over the hall's polished wooden floor. With the festivities outside, there was no one waiting to be serviced, nor any sign of recent entry. Everything was clean, brightly lit and undisturbed. After displaying the missive to one of the elder liches and speaking with them at length, Ludmilla walked away more than a bit confused. Someone was charming citizens and sending them to destroy industrial facilities. The local rangers couldn't track the true perpetrator, and the local administration lacked the appropriate resources to handle the situation. What exactly did they expect her to do? She had a cursory knowledge of magic and its applications, plus she was a ranger. This did not, however, somehow make her capable of dealing with whatever was going on. She looked over at Nobbe, who only looked back at her expectantly. The adventurer was assigned as her aide, which could have also meant that she was to assist in her capacity as a powerful arcane caster. Perhaps they could arrive at a solution together. Ludmilla put away the case records that the elder liches had provided, then turned to Nobbe. "To begin with, we should pay our respects and offer our congratulations to Count Valkenheim." Croston's festivities attracted many from its surrounding county, filling streets and open spaces with the press of human merrymakers. Whether they were there to celebrate a joyous occasion with their beloved leader or simply taking advantage of the food and beverage being freely provided eluded Ludmilla's ability to discern. What she did understand was that it was noisy, crowded and chaotic. In the past 5 minutes, I must have squeezed by the entire population of Warden's Vale. Going was slow. Ludmilla watched Nobbe navigate the crowd ahead of her, envious at the apparent ease by which she carried herself. Once in a while, the adventurer brushed away the groping hands of those who had grown bold in their merriment or perhaps had too much to drink. Far fewer reached out for Ludmilla, but when they did she kept her hands tightly to her sides and did her best to get away from their touch as quickly as possible. Hopefully, some previously unknown reaction didn't rise out of her discomfort. As for why Ludmilla simply didn't act to keep others at bay as Nobbe did, it was because she worried over what might happen. Various races possessed natural weaponry, usually in the form of teeth, claws or horns. Humans could be said to have natural weaponry as well, but what the average human could bring to bear was nothing relative to those possessed by other races. Monsters and other supernatural creatures often had attacks attributed with various effects, and knowledge of the attacks they might employ was crucial for those who fought against them. In her vocation, both as a frontier noble and an adventurer, Ludmilla was well versed in this lore, and could quickly analyze and identify the traits of unknown opponents should this knowledge fail her. Little did Ludmilla realize that she would one day be analyzing herself and the potential threat that she represented to the subjects of her own nation. While she didn't paralyze her victims like a ghoul, deliver negative energy damage with a mere touch like an elder lich, or curse others like a mummy, her natural attacks were very much magical in nature. She had unintentionally injured Ilishnish with her elbow, and that was impossible for a regular human. There were vocations that could grow to become powerful unarmed combatants, but Ludmilla was not one of those. Dragons were beings whose natural damage reduction required magical weapons to bypass. By Ilishnish's own account, a gold-ranked adventurer with a mundane weapon had completely failed to harm her. It did not mean that her elbow was more powerful than a longsword, but it did mean that different rules accompanied her new existence when it came to physical interactions. With her undead body came inhuman strength, combined with a complete lack of familiarity with that body. It was not dissimilar to growing stronger and weaker in the past, save for the fact that her natural weaponry potentially made it all too easy to inflict injuries. Some beings, like the Chronos Druids, were resilient enough to interact casually with. Humans, on the other hand, not only lacked any notable natural weapons but did not possess any natural armor either. Ludmilla grew queasy whenever she dwelled over what accidents might happen as a result of negligence or ignorance over some previously undiscovered trait. Brushing away one of the hands that reached out towards her could potentially slice open flesh simply by scraping someone with her fingernail. What would happen if she bumped into someone or they collided with her? To someone who once had a high degree of mastery over her own body, it was an untenable situation. Ludmilla experimented from time to time, but learning about herself was hampered by the fear of discovering just how inhuman she had become. Her circumstances were unlike the powerful servants of the Sorcerer King, many of which had natural weapons of their own. She wasn't huge and imposing like Lord Cocytus, with whom people naturally kept at a respectful distance at all times. Nor was she a vision of ephemeral beauty like Lady Shaltia, someone that nearly everyone considered far beyond their reach. Ludmilla was simply Ludmilla. While she might draw some attention, people were still more likely to bump into her on the street or treat her in a more casual manner. Even demi-humans like the lizardmen, who once flinched away from her in fear, seemed to treat her in a more open and friendly manner in recent times. Finally breaking through the crowd, Nobbe led them out of the town gate. From there, they went to a cleared field that was indicated by one of the elder liches to be where the main celebration was being held. The area was covered in gaily decorated pavilions, and the aromas of food filled the air. Nobbe stopped to frown out at the chaotic surroundings illuminated by bonfires and torchlight. It's customary for the bride and groom to be seated in the first pavilion, Ludmilla guessed at the cause of her confusion. That way, people can offer their congratulations before entering to partake of the festivities. Nobbe offered no reply, and Ludmilla stepped forward to join the rear of a short line. With it being so late in the evening, even a celebration of this magnitude would still be tapering off. They wouldn't have long to wait, and it was unlikely that they would be interrupting any ongoing wedding events or performances. A wedding, huh? Lady Shaltia contended for the position of queen consort, but Ludmilla had never dared ask her if the undead could have children. As far as she knew, the closest thing was undead created by other undead, like Death Knights raising squire zombies. It wasn't anything like a familial relationship. To her knowledge, this was a major part of life that was lost to her. House Zaradnik would exist as long as she did, but, at the same time, the family life she had been raised to expect was now beyond her reach. She would be a lonely bystander watching others journey through their lives for the rest of her days. Have you ever considered marriage, Miss Nobbe? Ludmilla frowned at her own words. She had intended to strike up a conversation to take her mind off of the topic, but instead, she had just brought it up again. Maybe the atmosphere made it inevitable. No. Nobbe's reply was immediate. Was marriage not a part of Moman and Nobbe's culture? Perhaps their relationship was such that there was no need for it. Or perhaps I missed my chance. Ludmilla scowled at the fleeting thought, silently berating herself. As attractive as the idea of a strong partner was, it was no reason to become some sort of unscrupulous strumpet. Belatedly, at that. Having the same reactions and feelings as a human felt like a cruel reminder of what she could never have. The line slowly advanced as her thoughts grew increasingly glum. When it came their turn to enter the pavilion, Count Vulkenheim and his bride, Lady Adelia Allard, had their backs to them as they refreshed themselves at a small table. Torkel Vulkenheim returned first, resplendent in his finery. Welcome. He looked up with a bright smile, Thar. His eyes widened upon registering his new guests. Lord Vulkenheim turned as white as his dress shirt before collapsing onto the rich carpet laid over the ground. T. Torkel? The new Lady Vulkenheim turned at the sound and ran towards her fallen husband, Torkel. Who? She gaped like a fish for all of 2 seconds before flopping down on top of Count Vulkenheim. Cries rose from the maids nearby, and footmen came running. Amidst the commotion, a hint of a cold smile crossed Nobbe's lips. How convenient, the adventurer's eyes glinted. To have annoying flies extinguish themselves in your presence. Is this a skill you can teach? An hour later, Ludmilla was seated with Nobbe in the tavern of one of the local inns. Sitting across from them was a familiar face, Count Vulkenheim's retainer, Andrei, who she had first met in Erantle early that spring. Ludmilla twiddled her thumbs under the table, resisting the urge to squirm under the uncomfortable feeling that she had ruined someone's wedding. I'm sorry about that, my lady, Andrei said. I should have at least sent a footman to wait for your arrival. No, Ludmilla shook her head, it is I who should be apologizing. I'm here by His Majesty's order, but I've ruined a special occasion in the process. It's my fault, really, Andrei said. I had no idea that you'd arrive so soon. With Zaradnik Barony being out on the border, I figured it would at least take you until tomorrow to arrive. Sanju delivered the request 2 hours ago. Sanju? Nobbe stirred at the mention. Ah, pardon me. Sanju is the elder lich that I've been traveling around investigating this string of incidents with. An elder lich with a name, Ludmilla mused. Do you know what it means? Andrei rubbed the stubble of his chin in thought. His gaze went from Ludmilla to Nobbe. It sounds like it's from a language down south, he said. Miss Nobbe might have an answer. Ludmilla turned her gaze to Nobbe as well. It's a number, Nobbe said. 30. That's not my fault, is it? The name Nonna had many meanings, and one of those was the number 9. She was the 9th elder lich to be trained under the new administration, and Ludmilla thought many of its other meanings suited to the elder lich's qualities. Sanju might have been the 30th, its name provided according to that same sense. That's interesting to know, Andrei said. Sanju is working at the Count's manor right now, but, did you come with anyone else? Elder liches or death knights to help with the investigation? It's just the 2 of us, Ludmilla replied. Do you believe that we require more assistance? To be honest, Andrei said, I wasn't sure what to expect in the first place. Sanju only called the option to my attention last week, and there were no real details provided. I definitely didn't expect Miss Nobbe here to show up. The presence of the adamantite adventurer was still a mystery to Ludmilla as well. Adventurers were not only used as hireable muscle, they would also occasionally be employed for their skills and knowledge for jobs that did not center around combat. One might surmise that, due to the nature of the incidents, Nobbe might have been called to offer her expertise on the matter as a powerful arcane caster. Understanding that His Majesty's order had been issued months ago, however, muddied things quite a bit. Why would anyone think to call upon the specific combination of Ludmilla Zaradnik and Nobbe of Darkness to perform an investigation in Vulcanheim County and have an order ready for their dispatch well in advance of anything happening? Perhaps it was the magnificent foresight of the Sorcerer King that Lady Shortier so often spoke of. Nobbe is here at His Majesty's request, Ludmilla said. It's not our place to question. As an adamantite adventurer from a distant land, she has probably seen far more than we can ever imagine. Perhaps that experience was considered crucial for the investigation. Of course, my lady, Andre lowered his head. It was just an idle thought. I didn't mean to question His Majesty's will. We're pretty stumped here, so I'm curious how the matter will ultimately be resolved. Ludmilla reconsidered her position after Andre's display of deference. By carrying out His Majesty's orders, one represented His Majesty's will. Be the one bestowed this authority a noble, a maid, or a horse, those under the authority of the sovereign were obliged to heed them. Having a noble in another noble's territory representing the sovereign's will was a weighty matter that could have many layers of meaning. She was broadly neutral when it came to her views on Vulcanheim County and as to why she had been specifically dispatched. Count Vulcanheim and his vassals could not know that for sure, however, and would have their own speculation over her presence. They could legally offer no resistance if someone showed up on crown business, but neither was their cooperation ensured. Lacking in the political acumen and diplomatic finesse that regular nobles possessed, Ludmilla could only hope that she came across as genuine. We'll review the information that the administration has provided us with tonight, Ludmilla told him. The town will probably not be in its best form tomorrow, but we should still be able to begin our work. I noticed that you were the one heading the investigation on these incidents so far. Was there something you'd like to personally add that might not appear on the reports? Andre had confirmed that he was a ranger when they first met. Going by his current strength, he was in the lower half of gold rank by Adventurer Guild standards. Assuming that being a ranger was his only vocation, that made Andre a better ranger than Ludmilla. If he couldn't track down the culprit, there was little chance that Ludmilla could in the same circumstances. A part of her wondered why Lady Aura hadn't been dispatched in her stead, but there was probably a good reason for that. I'm afraid I don't understand what you mean by that. The trace of a frown passed over Andre's expression. Are you suggesting that I'm withholding information? Not out of malice, Ludmilla replied calmly. The elder liches dispatched by the administration are both austere and stringently trained. As proficient as they are in what they do, they also have limited experience and tend to be inflexible about a great many things that humans do differently or consider important. They will note any information that comes to their attention, but, after interacting with them for a while, one may decide that it's a waste of time and energy to share certain things. Andre's look softened somewhat at her explanation. After a moment, it hardened again as he leaned back in his seat and crossed his arms. This isn't some sort of trick, is it? Trick? Yeah, to draw out complaints about the administration or something along those lines. No, nothing of the sort, Ludmilla smirked in the face of his suspicions. It's simply the truth. For a ranger, you have a strangely political view. With House Vulcanheim's history, can you blame me? With the generally congenial attitude that Torkel Vulcanheim displayed in public, it was easy to forget that his house had such a troubled past. Mr. Ludmilla prompted him for a more formal name to address him by. Andre is fine. Andre then, she said. What does House Vulcanheim think of me? Lord Vulcanheim's retainer adopted a guarded look, staying silent for several seconds. You're from a border house, Andre finally replied, which is something we can respect. At the same time, you're the one who brought down House Facet. As a retainer of House Vulcanheim, I thought that would be a point in my favor. Besides, I wasn't the only one there. It's a point in your favor, Andre conceded, but it's also a point against. The other noble women that went with you might be capable, but they all work within the rules of regular nobles that House Facet was able to dance around for generations. Border houses have zero tolerance for the game House Facet played, so everyone understands that House Facet's downfall is most likely your doing. The thing is, border lords don't have anything in their contracts that allow them to do anything of the sort. Andre's steely gaze held her own, but she only awaited his conclusion with a curious look. Compared to the relaxed and affable attitude he displayed in Irantal, The man sitting across from the table was like a loyal hound guarding his master. Perhaps this was because all rangers were especially sharp when operating in their element. Perhaps it was loyal vassals like Andre that allowed Lord Vulcanheim to carry on with his optimistic outlook. This means that you either broke the rules, his voice took on a blunt quality, or you play by rules that the rest of us aren't aware of. Given the lawful nature of the new administration, it would have to be the latter. And there it was, the reason why the House of Lords now feared her. In addition to being a powerful, militant noble, she had become something alien to them. Nobles were ultimately creatures of law, and she could punch through their paper shields for some reason unknown to them. They were penned-up livestock at the mercy of a savage predator. "You're right," Ludmilla told him, "it is the latter. I can't tell you what my contract entails, but I can tell you that these scattered incidents won't lead to a smoking crater where Croston once stood." A crater. Forget that last part, Ludmilla smiled. "I'm just here to see if I can help with what's going on here. If we track down the culprit, they'll be captured and tried. The central administration will probably handle things from there, as they'd want to make a study of it. If we turn up empty-handed, I will not do anything unreasonable out of frustration." Ludmilla stood up from her seat. "We'll be retiring to our room now," she said. "Please consider what I mentioned before. Also, please convey my reassurances to Lord and Lady Vulcanheim. I feel absolutely terrible about disrupting their wedding night." Ludmilla couldn't help but be aware of Nobbe's unrelenting stare as she pored over the county's judicial record. Long accustomed to seeing the occasional being disguising themselves as a human in the city, the bald and nearly featureless face of Nobbe's true appearance did not disturb her at all. It was just the fact that she was staring, and had been staring at her at every opportunity. As an escort, it was expected that one paid attention to their charge, but not to the exclusion of all else. While she occasionally checked the hallway outside and the area outside the window, Ludmilla wondered if Nobbe had received some specific instructions not mentioned on the king's order. She couldn't come up with any reason that would merit such intense scrutiny, however. A chill traveled up her spine when she considered Nobbe's behavior from another angle. Nobbe stood at the pinnacle of an organization dedicated to the destruction of threats to civilization, an adamantite adventurer. The undead were universally accepted to be one of those threats. While this was no longer the case for the Sorceress Kingdom's Adventurer Guild, culture and perception were difficult to shift in such a short period of time. "Miss Nobbe," Ludmilla's tone was tentative. "Have you destroyed many undead in your career?" "Yes." Ludmilla winced. The answer came simply and without discernible malice, but she couldn't help but think it was twisted in some way to be aimed at her. "Then, how do you feel about His Majesty's undead servitors?" Nobbe narrowed her eyes at the question. The veteran adventurers based in Rantel once made most of their living suppressing the undead in Katza Plains, and it was not something they would proudly call attention to in the Sorcerer's Kingdom. A line of query such as the one she presented might have drawn a similar reaction from them. "They are His Majesty's servitors." Nobbe's expression returned to its usual passiveness. "Why are you asking me this?" "I suppose I was curious over how different individuals react to the undead. How other nobles have handled the introduction of His Majesty's security forces and undead labor is of particular interest." "What do you mean by that?" "By all reports," Ludmilla explained, "darkness has been visiting all of the territories in the duchy on a regular basis. I thought you would be more aware of the differences than I am. For instance, how many undead are visible in Croston?" Nobbe rose from her bed, going over to the room's window and throwing open the shutters. The night breeze played through her jet-black hair. Having compared the town to its appearance when she last came through in the spring, Ludmilla already knew what scenery would greet her. It was a diplomatic approach to adopting the new systems that could be considered characteristic of human aristocrats in the region. The minimum requirements of the central administration were met. Beyond that was a balance where the reservations of the local administration were laid bare. Undead sentries were kept out of sight. Patrols were left on the sparsely populated borders of the territory. Elder liches stayed in their offices. It was the softness of the inner nobles. While not explicitly corrupt or malicious, it was a display of the human tendency to favor what was comfortable and familiar. There were no dire threats present in the inland territories, no demi-human tribes or monsters lairing nearby. Nothing that told them you must adapt and act, or you will perish. Without a whetstone to keep it sharp, one's sense for danger grew dull. For people in peaceful lands, this danger was the stagnation of culture and the slow decay of society. A noble's duty was to find a way forward for the lands that they were responsible for. A noble's authority, however, made it all too easy to maintain the status quo, a comfortable and familiar place. Though the common people could sometimes improve their own lot in life, they could not bring about sweeping societal change. They lacked the resources, authority and influence to address widespread problems or enact progressive policies. This was especially so in the Sorceress Kingdom, where any revolts or dissent could be so easily crushed by those in power. Leaders brought change. When leaders did not act, only their peers or those that stood above could prod them forward. The Prime Minister was an excellent executive administrator, but she was not a radical. Her methods involved compiling vast amounts of information and issuing policies that moved the nation in the desired direction step by rational step. Steps formulated by compiled statistics and the laws set forth by His Majesty. The same laws that the nobility followed. As the Prime Minister of His Majesty's government, Lady Albedo had dug in her heels, determined to drag the Sorceress Kingdom forward against the currents of culture and nature. As long as the administration achieved her policy goals, which were set in increments that were well within reason, she would inevitably reshape the nation to her satisfaction in the long span of eternity. It did not matter how many human lifetimes passed as long as she met her objectives at what she considered an acceptable rate. Another question was what would then happen once the Prime Minister reached a place that was comfortable to her. Would she, too, fall into the same trap? Like the nobles who now possessed the power to maintain order, the Sorceress Kingdom had the power to maintain whatever state it considered ideal against all convention and sense. Changing the direction of the seemingly unshakable central administration could only be done in three ways. The first was through direct intervention by the Sorcerer King. Members of the royal court, too, could potentially sway the policies of the administration. Lastly was to provide new information that called for existing policies and directives to be reconsidered. The Sorceress Kingdom had solidified its footing, but its potential was far from fully harnessed. For the Sorceress Kingdom to move forward, its subjects also had to be ready to move forward with it. One could say that the Sorceress Kingdom occupied a position of safety and provision, but the foundations upon which the nation would be built were still in the process of being laid. Moman says that these measures are reasonable for now, Nobe said. That rapid change is disruptive. Are you suggesting that the incidents here could have been prevented? No, I was just pointing out how different perceptions of the undead exist. As you might have noticed, Warden's Vale has as many undead servitors in civilian use as there are civilians. I was curious what you thought of the undead, Miss Nobe. So it has nothing to do with our task here? Not directly, no. Nobe closed the shutters, returning to her bed to resume staring at Ludmilla. Is there any particular reason why you keep watching me so intently? Yes. May I know what it is? No. With the awkward conclusion to their discussion, Ludmilla turned her attention back to the county records. The night passed, and she felt more than a bit hunted by the time light started leaking through the window. Being stared at all night was decidedly not an experience that she savored. It should be about time, Ludmilla said. We should head down to wait for Andre. The cases she had been sent to investigate were simple, yet resolving it was problematic. Someone was using something akin to a charm person spell to commit crimes, and they were doing it in a way that their victim could not recognize the spellcaster. Since the principal method of solving already committed crimes in the Sorceress Kingdom involved using charm spells to take statements, locating the people that physically engaged in criminal acts only led to finding an innocent victim. They knew nothing, save for the fact that they had been magically compelled. In the inn's tavern, they discovered Andre already waiting for them, seated at the table they had occupied the evening before. Good morning, Lady Zaradnik. Andre rose and inclined his head. Miss Nobe. Good morning, Andre. Ludmilla waited for Nobe to complete the exchange of greetings, but it appeared that nothing was forthcoming. Andre smiled at Ludmilla's discomfort. I've known Miss Nobe for over a year now, he said. So I'm accustomed to at least this much. Over a year? Yes, Andre nodded. Torkel, that is, the current Count Volkenheim, and I went to Erantle to hire adventurers for his coming-of-age ceremony. That's when we met Darkness. It must have been quite the coming-of-age ceremony if it required an adamantite adventurer team.
Ah, no, Andrei chuckled nervously. That was at my lord's discretion.
The ceremony itself is for scions of House Volkenheim to prove themselves capable of dealing with demi-human threats. As you probably understand, the decline of the frontier lords in the past led to Volkenheim County being responsible for local frontier threats. Adventurers were hired to act as guides and escorts.
Well, we did end up running into something ridiculous, so it was money well spent.
Ludmilla nodded in understanding. Internally, however, she held severe doubts over the worth of such a ceremony. Proof that you could kill something in a safe situation did not mean that you could manage a territorial border.
What happened after you returned? Ludmilla asked.
After?
Yes, she replied.
Did he go on to deal with any encroaching threats, or? The rest of the year was uneventful, Andrei told her. There were no threats from the wilderness to respond to, fortunately. His tone and description told Ludmilla all she needed to know about House Volkenheim's commitment to the defense of the realm. She had nothing against them personally, but Andrei's words left a sour taste in her mouth. They did not speak to her of any true pursuit of a militant noble's duty, nor respect for it. There was no indication of the endless preparation, training and investment required to maintain a similarly endless vigil throughout the seasons. The ceremony was warning enough of this, but the answers to her follow-up questions confirmed it. House Volkenheim employed adventurers for the rite of passage because it was what they believed that the defense of a realm entailed. An exciting, direct battle, proof of mettle and skill at a decisive instant. It was the way that the inland nobles of Riestais understood militant matters in general. Ludmilla's father often shared his thoughts on such views, usually right after the annual skirmish with the Empire. Satisfied that they had proven their might before not just the Empire, but to one another in a bout of meaningless pageantry, they packed up and went home. Similarly, Torkel Volkenheim had gone out and proven that he could do what adventurers did. As adventurers were frequently employed to deal with the occasional threat that appeared in more civilized lands, it was seen as proof of being able to deal with those same threats personally. As compassionate and well-meaning as he was, the Count was woefully misguided when it came to the value of his house's traditions. Given his former situation, Ludmilla held the fleeting thought that Count Volkenheim might qualify as a commander for the nascent royal army. He was, however, probably far better suited to managing his territory and its people. I see, Ludmilla said. Well, shall we get going? I'd like to see the sights of these incidents. Of course, Andrei said. Before we leave town, Count Volkenheim would like to. There's no need to see Lord Volkenheim, Ludmilla told him. Ladies are. Also, it's probably best to avoid anything that might give my presence away. In hindsight, my decision to see your liege in such a highly visible manner was also in error. Respect for the proper protocol in more normal circumstances got the better of me. A frown crossed Andrei's expression. He clearly was displeased by the turn of events. My lord will be worrying himself into an early grave at this rate. You did report to him after our discussion yesterday evening, yes? I did, Andrei replied, but Lord Volkenheim knows not to take everything at face value. Count Volkenheim's retainer was skirting a very dangerous line. Ludmilla was carrying out a royal order, and even the slightest hint of resistance could be considered opposition to the sovereign's will. Casting the shadow of doubt on her word was even worse. House Volkenheim either harbored a serious grievance, or its retainers were extremely protective and loyal to their liege. Trust has to start somewhere, Andrei, Ludmilla decided it was the latter. Has His Majesty's government given House Volkenheim any cause for one of the Sorcerer King's vassals to act in this manner? Andrei's lips pressed together into a thin line. After a moment, he turned his head to the side and blew out a long sigh. No, he said. I'm sorry. Everyone is just tied up into knots over your presence here. You have a fearsome reputation, lady. Camilla. Just Camilla will do. And I honestly don't understand where most of that reputation comes from. The ranger gave her a strange look. Did she say something out of sorts? Maybe it was the name. I'll go pick up Sanju, Andrei told them. We can meet up about 2 kilometers from the eastern gate on the road that leads north. Will that be acceptable, Miss Camilla? We'll be there. Andrei nodded slightly in affirmation before turning away and leaving the inn. As the door quietly shut behind him, Nobbe walked up beside Ludmilla. Lady Sheltier would have taken his tongue for that, the adventurer said with a barely restrained edge to her voice.
Ludmilla believed that she would.
Any loyal noble from Riestize would have done so as well as any unscrupulous individuals who reveled in wielding the sovereign's authority for self-satisfaction. Especially those. Losing capable subjects who harbored genuine loyalty, however, was the last thing that the Sorceress Kingdom needed. If anything, they needed more. Those with trust and respect for the leaders of the nation, those who could place their faith in something greater than themselves and serve as an example for others to follow. Arbitrarily culling those people away was a grievous loss to a nation that was only just starting to establish its cultural foundations.
I wasn't aware that you were well acquainted with Lady Sheltier, Ludmilla replied.
Nobe's hard expression faltered for just a moment, then she turned and silently glowered at the door through which Andre had made his exit.